Fangping, Spring Sadness. Through her curtains, she watches the sunset and the fading dusk. In her golden room, none see the stains her tears have made. In a deserted courtyard, where spring is almost over, pear blossoms fill the ground outside a door she never opens. So this is the second and last quatrain and the second and last poet of Liu Fangping included in this anthology. Liu Fangping, I think, had a reputation for pictorial ability, which probably is related to the way in which his poems are so very eminently visual. This happens a lot with many classical Chinese poems, but I think you can very easily paint these two poems of his, both the previous one, Moonlit Night, and this one, Spring Sadness, in a scroll. You can imagine them depicted very, very faithfully. Okay, so what's the topic of this poem? It's a topic we've encountered a lot of times. It's the lonely palace woman languishing in her boudoir, abandoned by probably the emperor or a powerful beloved. And just as spring is passing away, her beauty, her youth, her time of happiness is also passing away while she is alone in this luxurious setting. Now, this is a type of poetry we've talked about a lot before. We've encountered examples in this anthology. It's a poetry inspired in that of the period of disunion, the Six Dynasties, especially the poetry that was popular in the court of the Liang Dynasty, and that was collected in a very famous anthology, New Songs from the Jade Terrace, of the middle years of the 6th century, I believe. Now, during the period of disunion and during the Liang, there was this predilection for poetry for poetry's sake, of a poetry devoid of ethical and moral values and principles, as was extremely popular with the Confucians, of a poetry that's just an aesthetic pursuit that focuses on beautiful things, a courtly poetry, therefore depicting the world of the court, a poetry centered on objective descriptions of objects. And part of that poetry was, the boudoir lament. Beautiful women treated as objects encased in like luxurious surroundings of the palace with beautiful objects, gold rooms, silk curtains, jade ornaments, jeweled incense burners, that sort of thing. So they had a little bit of a peeping Tom element, these poems, I imagine, as well, a titillating, slightly erotic insider's view of the imperial palace and of the gorgeous women that dwelt there. But here it has also, in the tradition, this melancholy topic, because the woman in the boudoir is sad, is languishing. And again, this connects with an even older tradition of palace ladies, concubines, because the emperor has a lot, so some of them being ignored and left to wither away uselessly without any enjoyment of love or passion in sequestered and luxurious quarters. In a way, this tradition reminds me, it's very different, but it reminds me of the Petrarchan tradition in the West, in the way in which it became one of the great sub-themes and of Chinese poetry, just as the Petrarchan sonnets became one of the subgenres, the important subgenres of Western poetry, in the same way in which they both objectivize women. They both turn women into objects for the male gaze, whether it be, the precious women that in the Petrarchan sonnet is dismembered, if you will, into precious objects that compose the mosaic of the female self, like the coral lips and the golden hair and the ivory legs and so on and so forth, and or the turquoise eyes. And in the Eastern tradition, where we have this beautiful woman surrounded also by gold and jewels and precious objects. So that's the main theme. The title is very appropriate, Spring Sadness. It's the sadness of a concubine or a member of the imperial harem languishing, lonely, in some secluded quarters, and this feeling is intensified by the fact that it's spring. We've talked a lot about the correlation between nature and society. in classical Chinese thought. Now, this correlation can be strictly parallelistic and feeding on itself, but it can also be antithetic, it's contrastive. So spring, for example, is a priori not the season to be sad, it's the season to be glad. In nature, it's the season of universal renewal, of warmth after the dark and cold winter. It's a time when animals come out of their nests and mate. It's a time when trees are in flower. So it's this time of universal renewal, rebirth, and love. And in Chinese correlative thought, for example, spring was also a time in which human society should love and flourish. So part of this included things like, for example, death sentences were not executed in spring; they were executed in winter, which is the season of death. And many practices like rituals were favored in spring, and other cultural practices they were believed to take place, or they should take place predominantly in spring. Now here we get the contrast that it's spring, but it's a sad spring. And again, this contrast appears in a lot of Chinese poems, even more so than in happy spring poems, because the general tone of a lot of the classical poetry is sad, melancholy. So, but here there is a correlation between late spring and the woman. As we will comment when we talk about the last couplet, the fact that it is late spring, spring is almost over, very clearly rhymes with the fact that the female protagonist of the poem's own spring, her youth and beauty, is probably also over. So the period of pleasure and joy which a young woman is supposed to make the most of while she's still beautiful, because beauty, we know, doesn't last long. As the Romans said, collige virgo rosas, gather the roses in their proper time, virgin, because beauty will not last, and youth will not last, and love and the pleasures attendant to it will not last. So here, in the same mentality, there's this idea that beauty and youth of this beautiful woman are being wasted by her being locked in, isolated, alone, in some luxurious part of the imperial palace. Okay, let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet. So first couplet, through her curtains she watches the sunset and the fading dusk. In her golden room none see the stains her tears have made. So the first couplet, very clearly, it doesn't indicate the time, so because the first couplet usually works very well for setting the chronotype of the scene, that is the time and space. The first couplet tells us the time of day, so it's sunset. And sunset, just like autumn is the melancholy season of decline, sunset is the melancholy part of the day associated with decline, with death. And so we get part of the reference to the time, not the season, it's the sunset. We get clearly a place, a golden room, through her curtains. The poem starts from the inside to the outside, through her curtains. So we have these curtains in front of our eyes and in front of the eyes of the protagonist. Through them, somebody is peeping out. From an inside to an outside. What is happening outside? The sun is setting, it's getting dark, light diminishing. And in the second line, we get a little bit of a zoom out. There was somebody peeking through curtains. Now we zoom out and we see the place, which includes the curtains and the person, which is a golden room. That is, a luxurious palatial building. And in that golden room, that is a place of shiny, luxurious lustre and brilliance, none see the stains her tears have made. She has been crying, so now we know it's a woman, probably a woman. I imagine in the original Chinese there's no her, there's no female determinative or possessive. But, in this luxurious setting, she has been crying. No one sees the tears. Well, maybe they're difficult to see amidst the shininess and luxuriousness of her apartments, but probably more so because nobody goes in there. She's completely alone, and so nobody can see her cry anyway. Golden room, I imagine, is just a conventional expression for describing luxurious palace apartments. I think it does connect as well, perhaps, with an anecdote from Emperor Han Wudi of the Western Han, who, before he got married to Empress Chen, had told her that he would build a house of gold for her. And in fact, that has become an idiom in modern Chinese. Building a golden house for a woman means setting her up with luxuriousness and in a prosperous household. Second couplet. In a deserted courtyard where spring is almost over, pear blossoms fill the ground. Outside the door she never opens. So the second couplet moves us a little bit in space. It doesn't move us much. It moves us to the outside of this golden room. Again, the images of loneliness, of being deserted, of being alone, continue. So we have a deserted courtyard. So there's a deserted courtyard that leads probably to these golden rooms, to this part of the palace. But it is deserted. There's nobody there as well. And spring is almost over. And again, as I said at the beginning, I believe this spring is almost over, resonates with the spring of beauty and youth that is also over for this unnamed palace beauty. She feels the decline of the spring because she is matching the decline of the spring with her own decline. Finally, the poem ends in the last line with one of these shiny images. Pear blossoms fill the ground. Outside the door she never opens. She never opens the courtyard. She never gets out of her secluded box, of her jeweled cage. The pear blossoms fall. It's late spring, so the petals fall from the trees. Pear blossoms, generally white and shiny. And they would have been a contrast with the growing darkness of the sunset and the fading dusk and the personal predicament of the lady. But she gets no solace at seeing the pure whiteness covering the ground, because that door is never opened. Her door is locked forever. So, pretty typical poem of this subgenre, and I think pretty successfully worked out. Although I must confess, I do not quite end up seeing the attractiveness of this subgenre of poetry. As the titillating, peeping Tom part of it leaves me indifferent. I think scholar officials also liked a lot this type of poetry, and I think I've mentioned it already, because they kind of used it sometimes, like metaphorically, to represent themselves. Like the scholar official who is not employed or seen by the emperor and his ministers is a bit like the sad beauty in the harem who is not visited by the emperor. But anyway, it's okay as a work of art.